This week we're going to be doing an update on Twitter's most famous scaredy dog, Sophie from Romania, who, for anyone who hasn't followed the story, was a Romanian rescue who arrived in London to the welcoming arms of Rory Cellan Jones and his wife Diane Coyle, the Prof. But who was so profoundly fearful, she promptly hid behind the sofa for the best part of 6 months. And we're delighted to be joined by top broadcaster, podcaster, author and baker of fine bread, as well as dad to Sophie from Romania, Rory, to talk about how she's doing now and answer some of your questions about her progress. Hello, Rory.
Hello, Si. Good to be talking to you.
And to you, mate. And we've also got Nina here with us, who is going to keep us in our...
Well, she's going to provide a bit of structure, a bit of discipline, so that there's not too much whiffling and waffling and rambling, right?
Lord knows we need a bit of discipline.
Always.
Over to you, Nina.
Okay, Rory, I think it's fair to say this has been a bit of a journey, hasn't it? Sophie's...
What? What's been a bit of a journey?
Sophie's been with
Sophie.
you.
Is that what we're talking about?
You remember her.
Sophie's been with you 18 months. So how is she? Is she a different dog to the one that arrived and hid behind the sofa?
Well, as you say, it has been an extraordinary journey, and she is a different dog. I have to say it's gone a lot slower than we ever conceived when we got a dog. We knew that there might be a few issues, but her issues have been substantial, let's put it like that. But she has, in the last few months, since February in particular, there have been big changes. And she is a lovely dog and an affectionate dog when she allows herself to be.
Oh, bless. And she's out and about and going on walks now, about more later. But that first walk was an awful long time coming. How did it feel when you first went out of the gate with Sophie on the lead?
I can't tell you how much was weighing on it. And we didn't actually, well, we went out of the gate straight into the car. There was a huge build-up to it. Si had come and stayed with us for the first month of this year to try and get the harness on, to get to that stage, and possibly to go for a walk. And after 4 weeks, he had the harness on and left us 2 klutzes to try and take it forward from there. And it did take us another month to get to what we considered was the possibility of launching. I think I put it to someone, Si took us floating above the moon, in orbit above the moon, and then we had to land the craft. And one Saturday night, towards the end of February, Diane said to me, we're going to do it tomorrow. We're going to go to the park. We're going to take her in the car. And we're going to, see if it works. And you cannot believe how much tension there was. First of all, it turned out to be an icy morning and we were scraping the ice off the windscreen. She sat in the back with me while Diane drove this time, and she was just trembling constantly, absolutely terrified, because going in the car to her up until then meant going to the vet, which is, not usually a top outing for any dog. And we got to the park. It's very quiet. It was a Sunday morning. It was quite chilly. And I fully imagined that we'd try to get her going and she'd just freeze. And that would be that. But we got her out of the car and she did seem to freeze for a moment. And then she started sniffing after a while. And it was a new environment for her. And she began to explore. And suddenly, after a minute or so, I thought, we're walking. This is incredible. This is what I've waited 14 months for. We both had a little walk round this sort of virtually empty park. There were a few early runners which we were very wary of, thinking she might be terrified of, and she was a bit wary. And then there was an encounter with other dogs, which was extraordinary. We were frankly terrified. There were 2 black labs, I think they were, and they were both off the lead. One of them came charging towards Sophie, and we feared the worst, but it all worked out okay. There was a bit of bottom sniffing, a certain amount of growling, but it was fine. So we came back absolutely exuberant, because this was such a big day for us.
Yeah, one you'd waited for an awful long time. And did that getting out for a first view of the outside world change her in other ways as well?
Well, the important thing was, could we sustain that? Mm. And we were able to sustain it. And we had another walk a few days later, and then we started walking from the door. And we got into a pretty good routine of actually walking morning and afternoon from the door to the local park and back. So that was a huge change. Did it change her in other ways? Well, for us, it just meant that we had an engaged dog. Other things didn't really change. The difficulty of having people come to the house and get barked at very fearfully, her fear didn't subside. Although actually outside, as long as we weren't in the immediate neighbourhood of the house, she seemed to be a lot better with people than when they came to the house. She was beginning to get used to them and actually get curious about people and curious about dogs. So that did change. But I have to report that it's not been an easy, straightforward upward progression. In the last few weeks, she's actually gone backwards a bit in terms of walking. She's much less willing to go to the park. In fact, we haven't been on foot. We go in the car, but on foot or on paw, she freezes halfway there and just refuses to go any further. And that is getting more accentuated day by day. She's venturing less and less far. So it's a bit of a worry.
Well, I think we're going to come on to that because that was one of the most asked questions, I think, was the stalling on walks. So you last saw Sophie about 6 months ago when you were working on the harness and the lead. So after all that time, was she pleased to see you? Did she snub you?
Well, Rory will tell you that what she did in the first instance was bark at me. Perhaps not quite as enthusiastically as she might bark at a strange visitor, but she certainly did for a brief period of time. And then I pottered off to settle in to my digs in West London. And
upstairs, he's talking. It makes it sound like we sent him to some rough boarding house.
Yes, up the stairs into Siland. And when I came back down and went outside, she seemed to have a moment where she went, Oh, it's you.
You, the man with the nice cheese.
Hurrah. And she beated around the garden busily and did zoomies and then jumped up on my shoulders when I was sitting in a chair. And that was it. We just returned. In fact, we did better than return to our previous playful self. I think there was a significant upstep in the way that she responded to me. And I think that can be attributed partly to time and the process of just learning, but also to the work that Rory and Diane had done in the interim of just engaging her and spending time playing with her and being involved with her. And one of the other things that I think Rory didn't mention when talking about the difference the walks made was she started to become more enthusiastic about putting her head in the harness.
Yes, that's true.
You know, wearing the harness was something that she associated, which implies that she quite likes going on the walks, which means that there's more to the foreplanting, which obviously is a small obsession of all of ours. That was huge. She was much more relaxed. There was more tail wagging. She's inclined to approach people more, including Rory, which was a big job initially.
Yeah, I was not number one in the household. That was very much Diane. But she will actually come up now and cautiously and invite scratch behind the ears. And that's really very, very sweet and rewarding.
She also responded to her name with you. She's doing that now. If you say Sophie, she'll turn around and come back towards you. And she did that with you several times last week.
She's never predictable, though. It's a salutary lesson. If you think, we've cracked this, then the next day she'll say, nah, not doing that.
Yeah, it's not a linear progress. It's an up and then a bit of a plateau and a little bit down and then up. And some of the training also depends on whether she's actually up for eating the food. She's not always that interested.
She's not very food-driven, is she? She never has been. We've got her on raw food at the moment, and some of it she likes, and some of it, which is basically rather unattractive, raw mince. She just goes, you think I'm touching that?
Yeah.
Nah.
Yeah. And she does that with everything then, not just her normal food, but the cheese that she would normally think was ding dong or turkey, or I think the only thing she actually always takes is the chicken tikka malai from the local Indian takeaway.
Very exotic taste. That was actually one of the questions that someone posted on Twitter. I mean, she's still quite an anxious dog, isn't she? And I think someone was saying, how do you manage expectations? I mean, when do you just have to recognise there are some things that you have to accept you're not going to change? Do you have to accept?
Well, I'd like to ask Si that. This paw planting business, for instance, we were, to be honest, doing a little bit of dragging and in some cases carrying her across the road and into the park. And once she got in the park, she seemed to love the park again. But you've taught us, and I'm sure you're right, that actually you've just got to do what the dog wants to do. The trouble is, what the dog wants to do is getting less and less. Although what one finds oneself doing, and I did this morning, is going a little way and then she's coming back to the house, going past the house and then up and down the street time and time again. So I'm not getting a very interesting walk, but probably still a half-hour walk, just a lot of sniffing and a lot of turning around and coming back where we've come from.
Sniffing is dog social media, isn't it?
It is. It is. What was the question?
That was about when do you have to recognise that you need to accept and accommodate rather than trying to change?
Yes, there are certain things where if you're in a position to modify your behaviour in order to accommodate a nervous dog, then I think you should do that. You know, they're as entitled to choose in many ways as we are, but I do recognise the fact that occasionally that isn't practical. And carrying over the road when you have to go over the road and suddenly the anchors go on, I think that's absolutely fair enough. In terms of the paw planting, which we might as well do now, because we're there, in terms of the paw planting, there was a question around it, whether or not there's an issue with using food in training when you're dealing with behaviours that you don't particularly want, and whether or not you're sort of reinforcing the problem behaviour. And I think in that there's a question you have to always ask yourself, which is your dog upset or not? And if the answer to that is yes, anything that you can do to make positive associations between what they find difficult and something they already like, then you should be doing that, because the motivation behind that behaviour isn't to gain access to your chicken tikka malai, but it is to get the scary thing further away. And as you change that attitude, then the behaviour comes down. But if the reason for the behaviour isn't upset and it's just, I want to go in another direction, and that's different. That's about them acting on their environment and being able to influence outcomes. And if you pay for that, then you are going to get more stopping, because it's the shortest route to getting reinforcement.
I don't think we've done that, though. You see,
No, I don't think you did.
it's very difficult to know why she's doing it. Everybody wants to know, has there been a particular incident?
Not that
I
you
don't
can
think there has.
identify.
Not
No.
that I can. The one thing that I do wonder is, because it seems to slightly coincide, is we've had two runaway incidents in recent months. One where she just scooted by me out of the door and disappeared up the street, and she wasn't frightened in that case. And one where she was with her in a new park and she was very frightened. There were lots of children around and she managed to get out of her harness and disappear into the distance. Both terrifying for us. And I'm now wondering if they were also actually quite stressful for her, suddenly finding herself lost, and therefore making her more sort of home-centred.
I think it's possible. The thing that strikes me about paw planting often is some of her paw planting is clearly not upset. Her whole body language and her whole posture is fine. And sometimes on the walks that I took her on last week, she would be inclined to want to go into other people's front gardens. Bless her heart, right? And I'm a little bit easily embarrassed on that sort of front. So that's something that I don't want her to do. Now, on that occasion, she would tend to move along with just a gentle bit of persuasion, and she would move. And other times she looks distinctly upset. She's got a tucked tail, she's making herself small, her ears are flat, and she's quite clearly upset by something. But it's a real challenge to identify what. The trick is to know which is which. So what I was doing last week was starting to put some behaviours in place you'd be able to use to minimise the tendency to stall. And one of those is a let's go cue. So we were deliberately stopping and then let's go and moving, so that she starts to learn that let's go means we're moving on. And she was beginning to do that. She was beginning to do that.
Because we did have a specific question saying, how do you actually tell when she's afraid of something and not just having a teenage tippy tantrum? And it's basically body language, isn't it?
I think it's mostly body language, yeah, unless you can really identify what the problem is. And then I suspect Sophie would run, actually. I think she would pull and try and move away from anything that was obvious. Something that struck me as interesting, Rory, was that she would be inclined to start moving if things moved past her or things that interested her, which sort of implies that she's not upset. So cats, for example, like this morning,
yes.
right?
This morning there was a cat, and on a quite difficult walk, that's when she leapt into action, wanted to run across the road at it. Had to be restrained.
Yeah. And she's done it with joggers that have jogged past her and people, even just people walking past. And I've noticed the difference with people out in the world. My goodness me, she actually wants to practically go up and say hello to some of them. I mean, she's very curious, isn't she?
Yeah. And also more interested in other dogs. I mean, it's quite difficult. We can't let her off the lead. So she has a certain lack of freedom of movement. But you've been cleverly showing us how to use a long lead in a short way, as it were, to just give her a bit of slack in the presence of another dog. And she may growl a bit and snap a bit, but actually it all looks very playful.
It does.
When you allow her to be. It doesn't look like a problem.
No, I think it's part of her play style and her play introduction. The growling is that, because she had some opportunities last week where she got to go back again. I allowed the first one, and she went back and it was playful and there were play bows and so on. 2 or 3 invites. And that means that, my money's on she's going to play pretty well when she gets a bit of line.
So what's your top tips for using a long line side? Because it looks tricky.
It is tricky. I think my big take home with it is don't get too involved in trying to gather up the slack. Throw that behind you. If you're in a position to, throw it behind you, because it'll get sorted out at some time. And when your dog is settled and calm and investigating, you can start to reel that in. And don't leave too much slack in front of you, between you and your dog. Try and manage that, because if the dog gets up to speed, sets off and gets up to speed, that's a lot of slack that's going to suddenly take up. And the snatch on that, the pounds per square inch that a dog can deliver as a result of all of that forward motion can be really significant. That could be harmful to you or your dog. So aim to control it. Wear a glove is often a good plan, because then you can control the speed at which the line goes through the glove, and then you can start to slow it down as your dog gets to the end of it, so that they don't suddenly stop.
I think, Rory, you mentioned the other sort of habit Sophie has is she's inclined to bark at visitors, and that's pretty difficult if you're a sociable household, which I think you are.
We are, and we although I think we've become a bit less sociable because of this issue. We had an interesting event this weekend in which we had our young grandchildren to stay, and on Si's advice, and it was good advice, we just kept them apart, because they just frighten each other at this stage. There's a loud barking if anybody comes into the house, a retreat, but then sometimes a bit of a lunge forward. So for a child, that's really frightening. We didn't want that to happen. Si has shown us techniques, but they're quite difficult techniques, and certainly not techniques you could teach a child very easily.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always important to think in terms of safety first with children. And actually, one of the questions on Twitter was whether or not keeping them apart was actually reinforcing her fear of the kids. And the answer to that is no, partly because reinforcement isn't about emotions, but also we come back to that threshold thing. The right thing to do is to keep her under threshold and give her safe spaces so that she isn't experiencing that immense level of anxiety and fear. And if that means managing it rather than trying to train, keeping them apart is a completely legitimate approach.
Yeah. So what would you suggest, Si? Is it meeting them outside the house? Is there something else that you can do? Because I entirely recognise what Rory's saying with young children. You can't take them through a whole protocol of treat throwing or keeping distance or whatever.
I think there's quite a few things you can do. Indoors, you can start off with sound recordings. As absurd as it sounds, you can absolutely do that. You could record your own kids, even better, or your own grandchildren, and start to play those periodically at really low level. You can either go for just straight desensitization, or you can add counter conditioning to that. Then you can add something that gives positive associations with those sounds. My suggestion, though, ultimately, and we've done this, we've started doing this, Rory and Diane have started doing this with their grandkids, is meeting outside and going for walks.
One of the problems, of course, is the fact that she's not walking as far as she did. So if we say, meet you and the kids in the park, well, we might never get to the park.
Yeah, I mean, but then, you go in the car, so that might be an option to pick a park that's close to the grandkids so that it's easy for them to meet you there. That's an option because she's certainly better in the park than she is on the street, which is the irony of her not going to the park.
What about other visitors, Rory? Any progress there, or is it just too hard?
There are a few people that have been that are dog people and kind of know how it works. There was a woman who came from the publishers handling the book I'm doing, and she had a rescue of her own, and she just had the gift of throwing treats out while completely ignoring Sophie. Another friend who had more experience with cats and dogs also, after a few hours, had Sophie eating from her hand. So it can happen.
Although, I wanted to talk about the car, actually.
This is very important.
Yeah, the car, she's come on a long way. She's not jumping in it at the house, although she is standing quite close to it. Don't you think?
Yes. And I'm very focused on this because we're about to make her first ever long car journey. She no longer seems very frightened in the car. She was slightly annoyed because Diane was sitting in the back with her and she was climbing all over Diane. She was quite sort of excited. And then there were a couple of times when unfortunately she was sick, but it seems to have calmed down a bit now. Yes, we are going to Wales.
The holiday.
It can't be stressed highly enough what a huge hurdle this is, because A, it will be a 5-hour car journey, and B, it will be taking her to an entirely new environment, a holiday home. For the first time, she's faced a new environment since she came to this house 18 months ago.
Last week, what I saw of her in the car gave me huge encouragement, at least for the journey. So that I'm really confident about. The environment, we've got some strategies that we've been talking about where we can find a safe space for her in the cottage. And if she doesn't leave that, she doesn't leave that. Though I suspect that her sense of adventure and her sense of curiosity now is being piqued.
Might this be a first introduction to a beach?
Yes.
Well, that's definitely the plan. I mean, we're going for 2 weeks and we tend to sit in a very English way, wrapped up warm on the beach in a howling gale. So we'll have to see whether Sophie has any appetite for that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, dogs and beaches, synonymous, aren't they?
Mm.
So, Rory, other than the holiday, which is obviously looming for you, what else would you really like to, in terms of challenges, to get over with Sophie?
Oh, God, there are innumerable challenges. I mean, obviously, yes, to be able to go to other houses, go to other people's houses, get out of the house on a longer walk again. In the longer term, and this is a very sort of personal thing, I would like to get to the stage where we could leave her with people.
Yeah.
Because I would like to travel with my wife from time to time. And at the moment, that's very difficult. Si was incredibly generous last year with his time and came and stayed when we went on our Welsh holiday then. But we need to get to a situation whereby she can go somewhere to friends or, dog-friendly people and be okay with that.
I mean, one thing I would say about that, to anybody listening who is experiencing something similar, and of course there are going to be quite a few people, is think of it in these terms. If your dog can get used to one person, they can get used to two. And if they can get used to two, they can get used to four. How long it takes you is a matter of how much time you can apply to that. And I entirely recognise that people can't apply the same kind of time as somebody who does it for a living can. But nonetheless, that is a reasonable way to think about things. And so, although her sphere of people is small right now, it can get bigger. And by jingo, we're going to get it bigger.
Yeah. I mean, it is about accommodation and compromise. I think the word accommodation was a good one. It's not upending your life completely, though. Obviously, Rory, you and Diane have done that for some time, but hopefully not for good and all. But it's about making adjustments and accommodations so that you can live your life and she can thrive as well. I mean, I have to say, obviously, I haven't met Sophie. I only see what everyone else does on social media, but I can definitely say that I've seen the change in the relationship, particularly with you, Rory, and it's really, really lovely to see.
Yes, it is very rewarding, especially when it comes after such a long period of nervousness.
Yeah.
I'd like to talk a little bit more, come back to the question of the impact on people and bring to people's attention, perhaps, because we talk an awful lot on social media about how much progress we're making and about how well you are doing and about how well Sophie is doing. But in reality, the social media insights are sometimes misleading, aren't they? Because they tend to give a rosier view.
Yes, I mean, I post every day about Sophie. Diane posts most days. And it's very rare that we post anything suggesting things are going wrong. And obviously things go wrong quite a lot, just the sheer length of time it's taken. And I think people do get a slightly too rosy a view. We both love this dog very, very much, but there are negatives. I'm retired. I've got a degenerative disease, Parkinson's. I'm not getting any younger. And there are certain things I'd have liked to have done in the last 18 months that have not been possible, like go on holiday a lot more with Diane. So that is at the back of one's mind, and that focuses one on trying to get her to a state, for example, where she can be left.
Yep. I think for those of us who just follow Sophie on social media, it's really easy to underestimate the challenges and the commitment that it takes to help her. I know it's lovely seeing her progress. I've really loved seeing her personality come out, her playfulness and her sense of mischief. But I can totally feel the frustration that's involved. So much commitment needed. And I think that will chime with the people who followed Sophie's progress and responded to the threads, because they've been dealing with the realities of life with a fearful dog for months and in some cases years. And I think we have to say to all of those people, absolute respect.
Well, that's been an extraordinary chat with you, Rory. Thank you very much for coming on to the Sociable Dog Pod and talking about the progress that you've seen with Sophie and the continuing challenges that you're facing. All we can say is we admire you for it, and have a great holiday in Wales.
Si, thank you. This has been great fun. And Nina, great to chat to you. And good luck with the Sociable Dog podcast, which is becoming essential listening for me and thousands of others.
Oh, you're a
Thank you.
lovely man. You're a lovely, lovely man.